In today's video, we have a lot to cover, including trade rumors focusing on teams like the Winnipeg Jets, the Tampa Bay Lightning, the Ottawa Senators, Boston Bruins, and Edmonton Oilers. Plus, we have some news on the first buyout of the season and some additional signings. We'll discuss all the latest news coming up next. Welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. Now, as I mentioned, we have a lot to cover, so let's jump right in here. We have a couple of signings. First up, the Flyers have signed goaltender Alex Laine, who is set to become an unrestricted free agent to a one-year contract extension valued at $700K. For the most part, Laine has been a minor league goaltender. Has had some call-up action due to injury. He's been okay for the system here for the Flyers, so clearly they value keeping him around. Nice to have somebody with a fair bit of experience in that number 3 spot here with the franchise. The Sabres have also extended pending restricted free agent forward Curtis Lazar to a 2-year deal valued at $800,000 per season. Of course, Lazar started with the Senators, was a high draft pick, never really materialized to the player that they thought he would become when he was drafted, but has proven through a lot of grind and determination here, through a couple of other stops in the NHL, to be a useful regular player, even if it's in a bottom 6 kind of role. So Lazar gets himself a 2-year deal there with the Sabres. Now, the other interesting thing that happened today, just announced in the last few minutes as I record this at least, the Maple Leafs have announced another hiring of another assistant coach. They've hired Paul Mclean as an assistant coach, who was formerly a head coach of the Senators for about 4 years, back in 2011 to 2016, I believe it was. He's been an assistant with numerous teams, including the Red Wings. Last worked with the Columbus Blue Jackets. Of course, he was an assistant a long time with Mike Babcock, back in the Red Wing days before he became head coach of the Senators. So, a well-known player for many years. Been in the coaching game now for a long time as well. Looks as though he's going to be like their eye-in-the-sky type of coach and be like a general coaching consultant on all aspects of the game. Mclean was known at one point to be like a power play specialist type of coach, but we've seen a few stomps now where the power play that he's run hasn't been overly successful. So I know some were questioning maybe the future of Dave Haxtell with the Leafs staff, but I don't have any word right now to suggest he's going anywheres. But Mclean is officially with the Leafs as of now. Now, of course, we had our first buyout of the day, which, to be honest, I did find as a bit of a surprise. The Senators have bought out forward Bobby Ryan. He is on unconditional waivers for the purpose of buyout, so that'll become official tomorrow. Bobby Ryan has 2 years left on his deal, $7.25 million. Of course, he was signed to a big-time extension after being acquired in a trade right around the time that the Senators lost Daniel Alfredsson. He was acquired from the Anaheim Ducks. He never really lived up to the hype and the contract, which is understandable if you look at this strictly from a business side, money side of things. But obviously we saw what he went through last year, battled alcoholism, came back, had a great run at the end of the season. He had some good moments there. I thought they would continue to have him be a leader on this team, considering they're nowhere near the salary cap. And at this point, it's a question if they're going to struggle to even hit the salary cap floor. I didn't think they would go down this road. I don't think we've ever seen a case of a Masterton Trophy winner being bought out right after winning the award either. So I have no doubt he will bounce back and land somewheres. He was also a pretty good mentor, considering he was such a high draft pick, American-born player. And the Sens have a lot of American-born younger players as well, like Kachuk and White and numerous others as well, Josh Norris. So, I'm a little surprised they went down this road, because I thought he could mentor those guys at least for one more season after everything he's been through, but he will become an unrestricted free agent. This saves the Sens around $3.5 million over the next 2 years, and then they have 2 additional years added on to that with some dead cap space and a lower cap hit after that. So essentially, they're paying him about $7.25 million over 4 years. So it's a lot of real cash savings, and when an owner like Eugene Melnick's involved, every penny counts. Now, jumping into today's NHL trade rumors, let's get started with Tampa Bay Lightning, who are up 2-1 in the Stanley Cup final against the Dallas Stars. May end up being our Stanley Cup champion. We'll have to stay tuned to that. But obviously, as we know, when they officially hit their offseason, they're going to have some hard decisions to make. They have some big-time players like Anthony Cirelli and Mikhail Sergachev that are restricted free agents, going to be needing significant raises, and they just don't have the space to do it without moving some players out. That is going to cause 2 issues. One, it puts them at risk to be an offer sheet target for those players, which I know they'll do everything in their power to match. I don't believe for a second that Tampa would just walk away from one of those deals, unless it's a ridiculous amount, of course. But they're key players that have proven to be quite significant for them. But the problem is like I mentioned before, that my only issue with Tampa over the years is when Steve Yzerman was the GM especially, he handed out way too many no-trade clauses. So of all the players that they need to consider moving on from this offseason, most of them have no trades or a form of a no trade. So they can't. Some of them they can't trade anywhere without their consent, and some they have that have like a modified no trade. So like for example, you got Tyler Johnson, you got Yanni Gourde, Andre Palat, Alex Killorn. Like they all have a no trade. 3 of them, except for Killorn, are a full no trade, where Killorn is a partial this year. So they'll have a little more flexibility with him. And the same thing. You look at the top of the lineup, like Kucherov and Stamkos, etc. Like they're not that they would be moved anyways, but still, like they have a lot of players that just do not have. They don't have the flexibility. And then Elliot Friedman's reporting that it's been known that many players around the Tampa team have made it vocal and made it known that they have no intention of wanting to waive. So this is going to complicate things quite drastically, in my opinion, if they're not willing to move on here and accept a trade, which they're obviously not obligated to do. So it could force their hand at one of these young players that, even though they're super important and they'd want to keep them, they may not have a choice. As Julien Brisebois starts to explore all these different trade options, he's going to have a hard time. And I would not be surprised to see one of these players offer sheet it, because they're going to have a hard time to match, or if not, that they'll consent to a trade, but to move one of their young players instead because of the lack of trade protection. So I think they've kind of created this mess themselves. But hopefully, for their sake, they win a Stanley Cup, so that if they do have to lose some key players, it's not as big a deal. But still, you quite often see teams win the Cup and have some change afterwards, because you can't keep everybody because of raises and everything in the cap. But at the end of the day, Tampa is going to have a difficult offseason. We could see one of their young players on the move. Now, I saw reports today as well for the Edmonton Oilers indicating that it looks as though that they're really close to signing Jesse Puljujarvi. So it looks as though he very well might be returning to the Oilers. He's a player we've talked about off and on. At this point, all signs are pointing to the fact that he does sign and become a member of the Oilers and give it another go. I'm not sure what kind of deal he'd be looking at. It could be short term. And obviously, in his case, it's going to be a big adjustment coming back to North America, and he's going to want to make sure this is a lot more successful this time around. But the article I came across was also mentioning the fact that the Oilers and Bruins were apparently having discussions, and that if Puljujarvi is signed, that the Oilers might try to move Alex Chiasson. Now, that part of the deal makes sense, but apparently there was a rumor suggesting Chiasson going to the Bruins for Anders Bjork. Now, I from the Oilers side of things, I can say, okay, they get a player who's a little younger and a little cheaper, because Bjork's signed for the next 3 seasons at 1.6, but I don't know why Boston would want to do that. And we're going to talk more about the Boston Bruins here coming up, but I do expect a possibility with Puljujarvi likely being signed and coming back, that we could see at least one of the forwards moved out here from the Oilers organization. But one thing I would heavily consider as well, and I've mentioned this in other videos for the Oilers, what better way to bring back Jesse Puljujarvi than to consider bringing in Mikko Koivu as your number 3 center. Of course, the veteran guy's great defensively, good on faceoffs, could be a good leader, good mentor for his fellow player from Finland. Obviously, could be good influence on him. Put them on the same line. Maybe you sign Tyler Ennis as well, who's still with the team and going to be a free agent. Then you can have themselves potentially a really solid third line who's good defensively and not very expensive, because they're going to need some flexibility in that regard as well. So I would heavily consider that if I were Edmonton, to try to really help the young Finn who looks like he's coming back to the NHL. And of course, as we talked about the Senators a little while ago with the Bobby Ryan buyout, apparently they're getting tons of phone calls, and the TSN insiders are reporting that Pierre Dorion is one of the busier GMs right now, fielding a lot of calls from around the NHL. That apparently they're getting a lot of calls on potential RFAs that may not be qualified or might be available for trade. The Senators have a ton of draft picks and they have a ton of cap space. So there's plenty of teams out there, as we've talked about over the last couple of weeks, that are going to have younger RFA players that they may not want to pay their qualifying offer to, or they may not be able to keep around in their system because of cap constraints. And the Sens are in a situation where they could use some of those, especially those mid-round picks, second and third rounders especially, that could be turned into players who can help right away. Of course, they need to get to the cap floor, so they need to have a few more players here with a decent amount of salary on books here to make sure they get to at least the cap floor, which obviously they will end up doing. They could also be poised to take on a bad contract to replace that Ryan deal, maybe somebody on a 1-year deal, or somebody who could end up on long-term injury reserve, something to that they could actually get a sweetener with it as well. because they have the space. They need to do something here, and I can understand why teams would be calling Ottawa, because like I said, tons of cap space, tons of draft picks. If they could dump a young player that they don't want to keep for a second-round pick, that would be a deal that a lot of teams would be interested in making with Pierre Dorion. Now back to the Bruins for a moment as well. Frank Seravalli of TSN's reporting that he believes that the Bruins are kind of secretly, quietly, kind of fishing around the NHL to gauge what the trade value will be of goaltender Tuukka Rask. Now, of course, Rask has 1 year left on his deal at $7 million. There's a lot of uncertainty around his future with the team for a variety of reasons. There's a lot of talk about how he left the team and left the playoff bubble and all that. I mean, I know he had justified reasons. We're not going to get into that here today, but there was already talk about his future. He'd made comments before about retirement, not sure how long he wanted to play, all things of that nature. I mean, he is still a good goaltender and had a great year for the Bruins, so I'd be a little bit surprised if they wanted to move on from him, but the Bruins may not be a cap team this year, and they may want to find areas of the team to help for the future. Clearly, the Bruins' core players are not getting any younger, and with a $7 million contract and cap hit for Tuukka Rask, it might make sense if they can find the right deal to move him along and get another goaltender, I guess. But there is reports, though, that they are seeking that out. So, of course, as we know, the goaltender carousel is very, very busy this year. All kinds of NHL goalies that are either up for contract renewal or on the trade market. So we'll see if anything materializes on Rask. Doesn't mean he's going to get traded, but they are kind of trying to figure out what the value is to see if it makes sense at this point. Now, I also want to talk about Patrik Laine. The Laine rumor mill continues to churn, and there's all kinds of chatter around this young player from Finland and the Winnipeg Jets, and the fact that they are having serious conversations about trading him. Now, he's still really young, 35 to 40 goal scorer. I would recommend, as always, like I've said before, that they proceed with extreme caution here, because clearly these kind of players don't come along every day. They were very fortunate to get the number 2 overall pick in the draft a few years back and acquire this player. And, you know, obviously I understand they have needs on their team that need to be filled. They really need a number 2 center. They really need a top 4, ideally top pair defenseman. So, you know, he is a player who might be able to get you those things, but you're losing a lot of scoring in return. Apparently, teams that are calling are having a hard time believing, A, that he is available, and also have concerns over their ability to sign him to a longer-term extension and what it's going to cost. He still has another year left on that contract, and, you know, teams, I understand why they'd be leery of it because of the economic environment in the NHL. A lot of teams are unsure what they're going to have for revenue for the next year or so. You know, the cap's not going up. So I understand the longer-term concern when it comes to player salaries and contracts. So it might be a difficult deal to do. But the teams that are being talked about are Montreal, Carolina, and Columbus. Now, TSN is indicating that they don't feel Montreal is actually going to be big players for Laine. But if you look around, they have one of the better options for a trade. Like, if Winnipeg's looking for a center, they've got Danault and Domi that they're apparently considering moving. Looking for a defenseman, they have more than enough defensemen that they can include one. So, to me, Montreal would make a lot of sense. But they're saying now that Montreal not expected to be big players for Laine. So I guess we'll have to see. Bergevin could always change his mind, and maybe they just don't have the full details. Now, the other teams they mentioned was Carolina. Apparently, they have had talks with the Jets over a Laine trade, but apparently talks didn't get too far, is what they're saying. Obviously, Laine has connections to some of the players there, like Sebastian Aho, of course, former World Junior teammates, both from Finland. Clearly, they could make a dynamic duo there in Carolina. I can understand the interest. Now, Carolina would be a team who would be in a pretty decent position to make a trade. Obviously, they would have a defenseman, like, for example, like a Dougie Hamilton, Brett Pesce, a top right-handed D that they could include. I think the Jets would probably be asking for Hamilton in that deal. They might be wanting more than Hamilton, obviously, for a Laine deal. When it comes to a center iceman, obviously, Carolina does have some players that would kind of meet that need. Aho obviously wouldn't be going anywhere, but anybody else, they probably would ask for Natchez. I don't know if they'd want to include him. I'm guessing preferably not, but you just don't know what they would give up here for Laine. But the Canes could be real contenders, even though the existing talks haven't gotten too far. I can see them revisiting that if things get serious. And the other team that the TSN is mentioning here is the Blue Jackets, which I'm not surprised, but I'm not sure that they really have what they need. Now, Laine is exactly what Columbus needs, as we talked about just here in the past 24 hours about the Blue Jackets offseason plans. I mentioned they really need a game breaker. They really need another player who can score at a higher level, and Laine would exactly be that guy. However, if you look at what the Jets' needs are, being a top D and a number 2 center, How can they fill that? Do you see them trading Seth Jones for Patrick Laine? I personally don't. As much as, Laine would be an awesome, acquisition for them, I don't see them giving up Seth Jones. Would they give up Zach Werenski? Maybe. I'm not sure how they would feel about that, but you'd have to have one of those two D would be involved, because that's the only players that, for what the Jets would need at least, that would really have the value. I mean, if you look at the center ice, but I don't see them moving Pierre-Luc Dubois, because they would probably want Laine to play with him on the top line. And then, of course, like beyond him at center ice, they need help. They need a center themselves. Like, I wouldn't be looking at Alex Wenberg or anybody like that, or Boone Jenner. Foligno does play some center, but preferably more so on the wing. I just don't think the Blue Jackets would have what it takes unless they traded a top D. And I just don't see Jones or Werenski being moved. I mean, yes, they'd get a top scorer, but I don't know. Then you have a weakened blue line. I'm just not sure you're a better team. It's a tough decision. That's a tough trade to really decipher and decide what would be best in that scenario. Of course, in a previous video not long ago, I mentioned the Philadelphia Flyers has been a good fit as well, and I have seen some talk around them. They were not mentioned in today's update, but I can see them having more along the lines of what Winnipeg would want as well. Apparently, the possibility of Laine being traded is getting more and more likely. There's lots of talks happening. The Jets are serious about this, so we will see what happens. Give me your mock trades down in the comments, and we'll discuss further. If you're new to the channel, consider subscribing and turning on your notifications so you don't miss any future content. And give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. I'd appreciate it if you did. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time.